and welcome to today's Medicinal Monday on the Alter Your Health podcast. I'm Dr. Susanna.
And I'm Dr. Ben.
And we're both naturopathic doctors who empower individuals to take charge of their health, reverse disease, and feel their optimal selves through whole food, plant-based nutrition, and mind-body medicine.
That's right. And today we're excited to talk all about whole grains and really answer the question, are they healthy for you? But before we dive into our conversation today, maybe we'll start with about the upcoming Whole Food Plant-Based Challenge, which is happening online worldwide, and you can find out more about that. The link is actually kind of hard. It's but it's on our website. Just go to the website www.alter.health, and then you'll see the challenge right there. It's the anti-inflammatory challenge, and I'm really excited about this one because, of course, as you know, inflammation is really at the root of all disease in the body. But what's at the root of inflammation? That's a really good question that we're gonna be answering in that challenge starting on April 25th. It's of course free. We hope that you head to alter.health and join.
Yes. So today's topic is on grains. Grains, are they good for you? Should you eat them? What's their place in a whole food plant-based diet? And I'm excited about this topic because there has been confusion around grains, mainly because of certain diet cultures and trends like the paleo culture and the keto culture and so on. And so we're going to talk about all the myths, but also all the truths around eating whole grains.
Yeah, and it just occurred to me, I mean, I know Dr. Susanna, you actually were more kind of paleo-like when we met. For those of you who didn't know, yes, that's true. Dr. Susanna was more paleo-like, but were you ever entirely grain-free?
Yeah.
Oh, you were?
I was completely grain-free because a doctor told me to do so because of the big, bad, and scary lectins in grains.
Of course, we're going to be talking about lectins a little bit, but we've got a whole dedicated episode to the quote-unquote anti-nutrients, lectins and phytates and oxalates, talking about those phytonutrients. So we'll link to that episode in our podcast notes. But today, we'll be talking about whole grains at large and how they might be a healthy part of your whole food plant-based diet. But the paleo diet and of course any sort of low carb diet is going to demonize or marginalize these carbohydrate rich plant foods, which of course whole grains are definitely considered a carbohydrate rich whole plant food. But a lot of people just look at carbohydrate or look at whole grains and they think those are carbs. I don't eat carbs, no carbs for me. Would you like any carbs with on the side of your meal today? And people just think bread and pasta and cupcakes, that's just carbs. We always have to remind people that intact whole grains or just any sort of whole grain, any sort of whole grain food, even processed whole grains like breads and pastas, they're not just carbs. They've got proteins, they've got fats, they've got fiber, they've got phytonutrients, they've got minerals. That's not to say that they're not carbohydrate rich, because they are carbohydrate rich, but they also have all of these other macronutrients and micronutrients. Of course, intact whole grains, which we're going to be talking much more about, versus processed whole grains. Intact whole grains have many more of those other things, fibers and phytonutrients and such. But even processed whole grains are not carbs. So we want to break free from that macronutrient description.
Right. Yeah. So where shall we start today's conversation?
Well, we already did.
Yes.
But maybe we should go back historically, because I think like even our Paleolithic friends, not Paleolithic friends, our paleo diet friends, they say that, hey, humans have only been eating whole grains for like 10,000 years or 12,000 years, which is just kind of like a blip on the human history spectrum. But actually there's evidence that shows that humans have been eating wild grains of various sorts for over 100,000 years at least. And but even I like to steer clear from all of the scientific ancestral kind of historic data stuff, because looking back in history and looking at what we have done to survive over the course of human history doesn't always lend itself to understanding what is best to do now to thrive optimally in our modern crazy world.
Yeah,
So
surviving is really different than thriving, right?
surviving is very different than thriving. And of course, our whole grains that are existing on planet Earth today are completely different than the whole grains that existed just 1,000 years ago. And certainly different than those that existed 100,000 years ago. And of course, they're more widely cultivated en masse, and there are goods and bads and problems about all that kind of stuff. But here we are, and we have all this technology that we can utilize to optimize the access that we have to nutrients and foods. So here we are. So how can we use our current understanding, our current technology to optimize our human biochemistry and physiology to thrive?
Mhm.
That's the focus of kind of where we stand, at least. Not like we're not historians and just like how did we live? How can we get as close to possible to how we used to live for thousands of years, thousands and thousands of years ago? Because A, that's not really possible, because we're not thousands of years ago, we're here and now. And B, that, our caveman friends and relatives, they only live to be like 30 or 40 years old, to just long enough to maybe have some kids and, send off their kids to, do it all over again. And now we're fortunate enough to have grandkids and great grandkids, and in many cases great great grandkids, and be alive and thrive to enjoy generations.
Yeah, so, considering the whole historical aspect of surviving versus modern day, what we can do here to thrive, it poses a really good question. Like, where do they fit in? Because we don't think of them as being the most nutrient dense plant foods, right?
Yeah.
And so one might argue, well, if you want to get the most nutrition, then stick to the vegetables and forget the grains. But as we're going to talk about here, grains do have their own unique benefits for sure.
Yeah,
And so we'll talk about why they fit into our lifestyle that we consider is a lifestyle that you can thrive on.
that's right. And for those who don't know, we're actually in the midst of the Alter Health Spring Cleanse. And actually, during the cleanse, during phases 2, 3, 4 of the cleanse, we're avoiding all intact whole grains and all legumes. And that's not because they're bad foods, but it's because of what you said earlier, Dr. Susanna, about our focus during the cleanse is focusing on the most nutrient dense plant foods, the fruits and vegetables. But as we know, as we have experienced personally, and as we observe, it's really hard to sustain ourselves on the most nutrient dense plant foods, the fruits and vegetables. We would have to be eating a lot, and specifically a lot of fruits, which in a lot of cases, depending on where we are located, situated geographically, is not very sustainable. It can be very cost prohibitive, be very unsustainable environmentally, shipping all sorts of fruits around the world. But if we're within the tropics or whatever, it might make sense to eat more raw, fresh fruits and vegetables, those calorie dense foods that provide all of the nutrition, but most importantly, the energy to sustain us. For those of us who live at higher latitudes and don't have access to all the fresh fruits and vegetables all around the world, we literally need whole grains, things like whole grains, as well as legumes, as well as the starchy root vegetables like potatoes and winter squash and other roots, etc. These plants, including the intact whole grains, contain tons of energy, which is vitally important for our survival. So that's really, one could make the argument that we are here today because of things like intact whole grains that harness lots of energy for us to tap into when we, of course, cook them and eat them. And then we can get access to all that energy for us to survive and thrive.
Mm-hmm. Right. And those plant foods that are more energetically dense, they don't have the side effects like our animal products do, which animal products, they're also very energy dense, right? Very calorically dense, but they also have all the detrimental effects of increasing our cholesterol and being hard on the liver and kidneys and all these things. So
Yeah.
our grains don't have those effects in the body.
And if and of course we're going to shift gears and lose the historical conversation. But if we're just considering like the reliable, sustainable calories and nutrients to survive, hunting is not, I don't know, I'm not a hunter, but I don't think it's really a reliable way to rely upon getting calories. Of course, maybe it was, maybe not, but I think growing grains and growing legumes much more reliable.
You could argue.
One might argue. It depends on how good of a hunter you are, maybe. I don't know. But in any case, let's shift gears and talk about actually kind of the science and biochemistry and nutrition around whole grains. I think first starting just by identifying and defining what whole grains are. And grains are defined as being the seeds of grasses. And that being said, there are many pseudo grains, which are seeds, but not of grasses. I know quinoa is a pseudo grain, and also amaranth is a pseudo grain, because the plants that they grow from are not grasses. I don't know what they would be defined as, what quinoa the plant or amaranth the plant are, but they're not grasses. They're flowers or bushes or whatever. But grains are the seeds of grasses. And of course, people think about grains and they think about, again, a loaf of bread or a cupcake or bagels and things like that. No, grains are the seeds of grasses. And of course, people think, okay, well, there's the seeds of the grass. So like wheat, right? Wheat is like the only grass that grows on planet Earth, right? Just wheat. Well, no, there are tons of grasses that grow on planet Earth. Of course, there's wheat and there's oats and there's rye and there's barley and there's buckwheat and there's amaranth and there's teff and there's quinoa and there's all these intact whole grains. And then there's tons of varieties of each, right? There's tons of varieties of rice and wild rice and bulgur and different types of wheat and spelt. The list goes on and on. Yeah. Anything to add to that conversation? What are some of your favorite intact whole grains?
Well, you didn't mention millet. You didn't mention farro, or maybe you did mention farro. I don't know. You named a lot of them.
Another one that actually kind of slips through the cracks is actually corn.
Yeah.
Corn is, not really a vegetable. Corn is the seed of a grass. Corn is a grass. Corn is the corn kernel is the seed. And of course, some people eat it fresh and raw off the cob, more like a vegetable. But technically speaking, it's the seed of a grass.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very, very cool.
And when we're talking about grains, do you want to talk you're just handing over the conversation to me?
Well, you are on a roll, so I'll let you go.
Okay. You're just, yeah. Okay.
Well, you're going over all the science stuff, so I'll just let you continue with that.
Well, when we're talking about grains, another thing that, of course, gets wrapped in this conversation, I don't eat grains because I don't eat gluten. I don't eat gluten, so I'm just grain free. And we always like to remind people that gluten is a protein that exists in just 3 of this long list of whole grains, right? Gluten exists in wheat and barley and rye. And some might argue that it also exists in other forms of wheat.
Oh yeah, of course.
Like farro and spelt are different forms of wheat. So of course, okay, maybe a few more varieties of these intact whole grains. But then another problem is like, oats, I see that it says gluten-free oats, and, I only eat gluten-free oats. And well, all oats are gluten-free. But when we're talking about these grains and the refining and processing and milling of grains, oftentimes they use the same machinery to do so. So a lot of the gluten proteins that are contaminated on the machinery get kind of cross-contaminated with other whole grains. So gluten-free oats, I guess what I'm trying to say is all oats are gluten-free, but gluten-free oats are processed and milled in a way that is free from the cross-contamination from other glutinous containing intact whole grains.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. And we have a whole nother podcast episode on really the difference between like wheat sensitivity and
But
really glyphosate sensitivity.
well, we do. I thought that it was important to bring that up though, because a lot of people
Yeah.
would argue like, oh, I don't do well with grains.
Yeah.
I,
And
I
let's talk. I'll share a little bit more about that because.
I'm waiting for you.
Okay.
Been sitting here just running my gums, just like, is Susanna gonna talk?
So the reason why there is such an increase in wheat sensitivity is because people have actually become sensitive to the herbicides that are often sprayed on wheat containing grains, but also other grains and other legumes. And this herbicide that really the one to focus on is glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup. And it's pretty much used in all conventional wheat farms and also other grain farms throughout the country. And so, if we continue to expose ourselves to glyphosate, what happens is that the immune system starts to associate even clean wheat or clean corn or clean. I know soy isn't a grain, but that's another crop that's heavily sprayed with
It's
glyphosate.
a legume.
They associate these clean foods, like organic foods, with glyphosate because of that cross reactivity that's happening in the immune system.
Right.
So it's not actually that gluten is the bad compound or that any other compound in these grains are the bad compound. It's that your immune system is associating those compounds with the toxic glyphosate.
Yeah. And then, of course, when people are talking about grain sensitivity or just not digesting grains well, maybe then lectins or phytates become the culprit, right? Because we know that those are really bad and scary molecules as well. But this brings us in the conversation around general food sensitivities and how the underlying cause of generalized food sensitivities is a microbial imbalance or dysbiosis of the gut microbiome. So if we are avoiding grains, if we're not going to be eating grains, then we're going to be deficient in those microbes within the gut that help us digest and break down the fibers and phytonutrients associated with those grains. So when we do have a big serving of organic whole grains, we might get a little bit of a tummy ache. We might get a little bit of bloating. We might get a little constipated. But if we introduce those grains in a slower and lower fashion, kind of little by little, and also working on diversifying the different varieties of grains, we create more sustainable diversity of microbial life within our gut that helps us digest and break down these things, and in turn leads to more digestive resilience and optimal digestive function, all sorts of other anti-inflammatory effects from creating short chain fatty acids and all sorts of things that help our downstream colonic and gastrointestinal health. So that's one thing that diversifying our plant foods and higher fiber diets in general has going for our health, is really adding to that microbial health and biodiversity within our gut and optimal digestive function, which, by the way, also helps us combat and defend ourselves from the insult of, say, an herbicide or pesticide or antibiotic, because we have this protective biofilm and resilience that's built into our barrier of the digestive lining that helps us. So our moral of the story here is to, if you haven't got picked up on it thus far, is to not be afraid of these intact whole grains and to actually consume them in a diverse sort of way. But if we have been grain free for some time, then we need to be maybe a little bit more mindful and not just go out and binge on like a whole pot of quinoa or a big thing of wild rice or, corn, whatever. We can take it easy and go low and slow.
Yeah, let your microbiome adapt. But the other thing that's really important that maybe you've picked up on already is to eat organic grains.
Yeah.
Because, like we said, those conventionally grown grains, those are the ones that are sprayed with the herbicides that can disrupt our immune system and microbiome.
Yeah.
And it's not even just GMO conventionally grown crops. Even non-GMO wheat, for example, is still sprayed with glyphosate because they actually use it as a desiccant in the harvesting process to dry it up so they can get kind of more harvests throughout the growing season.
Right.
So the big rule of thumb is whenever you're eating grains, buy them, eat them organic.
Lastly, I want to wrap up talking about the different parts of grains. And we've been using the term whole grains and intact whole grains. And I think it's helpful to understand the different kind of the anatomy of a grain, if you will, and understand the difference between a whole grain, a processed whole grain, and an intact whole grain. Right. So a grain contains a few different parts. It contains a germ, which is, starting from the outside, the bran, which is kind of the outer, it's not the husk because that's a different part. That's actually the whole, or the husk is outside of the bran, but the bran contains fiber and B vitamins. Some intact whole grains also contain the hull, or the husk, which is generally just fiber. And then the germ is inside of the bran, which is, or actually the germ is inside the bran, and that's where a lot of the protein and minerals and fats are. That's kind of the fatty portion and mineral dense portion of the whole grain is in the germ. And then the endosperm is really the energy dense part of the grain, the carbohydrate rich part of the grain, which also has vitamins and minerals and proteins and such, but it's generally the carbohydrate rich part. So processed and refined grains strip away the bran and the germ, and we're left with generally just the endosperm. That's the energy dense, carbohydrate rich part of the grain. But a whole grain contains the bran and the germ in addition to the endosperm. So we've got many more vitamins and minerals and fibers and proteins and fats in addition to the carbohydrates. So that's important to know. But I think the bigger part of the bigger thing to understand is the difference between a processed whole grain and an intact whole grain. Because when we go out to the grocery store and we look on our shelves, we see all sorts of breads and pastas and crackers that say whole grain this, whole grain that. And whole grain means that they processed the grain, but they kept in the bran and the germ, but they ground it up and processed it, and but they processed the whole grain. But in processing the whole grain, what we do is we break apart things and we create like a flour of some sort, right? And in doing so, we create an abundance of surface area, which predisposes all of those vitamins and minerals and fibers and phytonutrients to oxidation. And then we lose nutrient density of that whole grain, and we're left with more of an empty calorie, more of a nutrient deplete food. So the intact whole grains that are unprocessed, and we can actually see the intact whole grain, like a bowl of rice, a bowl of quinoa, a bowl of buckwheat, not buckwheat pasta or rice flour or oat muffins or anything like that. We can see the actual intact whole grain. And when we can see the intact whole grain, then we can know that more of those nutrients, more of those vitamins, more of those minerals are active and alive. And there are also higher amounts of fiber and other phytonutrients that really fuel us and offset any sort of metabolic damage or oxidative stress that can come from just existing on planet Earth.
Mm-hmm. And we have a great question here from Brooks about sprouted grains. Can we speak to sprouted grains? Yes, that's a really great question. And you do see a lot of sprouted grain bread and sprouted grain this, and you can also sprout your own grains. You can create like amaranth sprouts in your own kitchen, for example. But let's speak to, the kind of wave trend of sprouted grains, because I think one of the reasons why I've seen there be that in the flux of more sprouted grains in like
what are you saying?
No, there have been more sprouted
for
grains
decades, right?
Well, yes, but I mean, I feel like there have been more sprouted grain products now on the market. And one of the reasons why people like sprouted grains is because, and this goes into the anti-nutrient discussion, which we haven't really talked about today, is because when we sprout grains, one thing that happens is we essentially kind of what?
No, I thought we were wrapping it up, but
Well, I know, but there's this great question, and we haven't addressed the anti-nutrients yet.
Yeah.
So when you sprout grains, you can essentially lessen the amount of phytates and essentially lectins in that grain as you strain out the water that you've soaked the grains in, and then you can cook those grains. And for some people, it is more easily digestible, especially if they have that kind of compromised microbiome.
Yeah.
However, it's really important to recognize and make the clear distinction that these phytates and lectins are not inherently bad for you either. They might be irritative to someone who has an inflamed gut lining.
We already talked about this.
We did?
Yeah. We already talked about the general food sensitivities. And if you don't eat grains, then the phytates and the lectins and the fibers and the proteins in the grains might compromise our digestive microbiome.
Right.
But the answer is not to avoid them, is to actually, focus on more diversification.
Yeah. But sprouting grains can make them easier to digest in that sense. But also, if you're actually sprouting grains like in your own kitchen and creating sprouts from them, of course, that's going to be a living food. That has like that's a whole different thing. And you can put those sprouts on your salad, and that's very nutritious. It's a great way to increase nutrient density.
And I mean, I think that really this question is probably more talking about the products that are, like Ezekiel bread. Mm-hmm. You see like sprouted whole grain bread. And of course, we know that that's still processed grains. Of course, maybe we could end talking about just the spectrum of processing, right? Because there's, of course, ultra processed, hyper processed, super processed, refined grains, the white bread. And then there's Ezekiel bread. And then there's the intact whole grains, right? So of course, there's all sorts of products and things. And maybe there's your grandma's or your recipe of fresh baked bread where you grind your own bulgur wheat or whatever it is, or buckwheat. What?
Well, you just did it to me.
So I'm talking about a very important thing. Talking about probably the question that everyone has. What about this bread? What about that cracker? What about this tortilla? Well, the fact is that it all exists on a spectrum. And we want to focus on the side of the spectrum that is more intact. So I guess one might make the argument that the Ezekiel whatever is more intact whole grain. You can kind of see bigger chunks of stuff in there. Looking at the nutritional label, it's also a good indicator because it's higher in fiber. There's always something to be said about the carbohydrate to fiber ratio when choosing a processed grain product. We want a higher fiber, means that it's less processed. That's always a good rule of thumb. But we can always also choose the intact whole grain alternative, which is always going to be the best option.
Yeah, so I'd like to wrap things up by just giving you our perspective, why we choose to eat whole grains and why we include them, why we recommend people eat whole grains is because of some of the benefits, including just the fact that there are unique vitamins, there are unique soluble fibers that you can get from grains and not from other food. I mean, not unique vitamins that you can get only from grains, but that are more abundant in certain grains. Like B vitamins are very abundant in whole grains.
And let's not just forget the fact that they're cheap and accessible, and like they store well, and there's the good staple. And maybe we shouldn't be eating the same grain every single day. Maybe we should choose to diversify. We haven't brought up the conversation around like arsenic and rice, for example. But the fact is, every different whole grain has different pros and cons. And the best way to hedge our bets is diversification, right? So rice and brown rice and wild rice and buckwheat and bulgur and teff and amaranth. And we can always do better about bringing in more diversity, but it's good for the microbiome. It's good for our health. It's good for the health of a lot of things.
Yeah, it's a great staple. Yes, you could totally just use potatoes as your staple or potatoes and beans as your staple and be fine in a plant-based diet. But whole grains are another really awesome staple, another great way to get that concentrated energy to fuel your metabolism and also to just switch things up and keep it fun and interesting.
Yeah.
It's fun to have different textures. It's fun to have different varieties of grains.
So don't be afraid of grains.
Don't be afraid of grains.
Give them a chance. Focus on the intact.
But for sure, like this microbial piece of your microbiome, the more grains you eat, the more microbes you have that can digest phytates, that can digest
Right.
those lectins. And so um, we actually encourage that people do include grains when they're shifting.
Call us crazy,
Call us crazy.
but we go with the science. And of course, we could go on, and we are going on in a little bit of a unproductive way. But when you look at the longest living, healthiest populations around the globe, also they're eating lots of whole grains, lots of intact whole grains, as well as the legumes and nuts and seeds and other herbs and spices. So if you enjoyed this conversation, let us know. Feel free to provide any sort of feedback. If you have a grainophobe, someone who is afraid or fearful of grains in your life, you can share this information with them. Do so lovingly. And as always, we appreciate you and look forward to seeing you next time on the Alter Your Health podcast.
Bye for now.